Okay, what I'm going to do now is start at the very beginning, because as I said, the surfacing is not a superficial consideration. You have to actually plan surface. Even if you want to just use overglazed decals, you've got to still plan how you use them right at the start when you throw the pot. It also gives you the opportunity, when you start at the beginning, to put textural surface into the pot. That's part of the act of throwing. I'm going to throw most of the demonstration pieces or do them on tiles or broken bits of pots, because that's what happens in the studio and that's real life. But I'm going to do it on thrown pots because for me that's the quickest and easiest way to make a demonstration piece. So I'm just going to quickly throw this pot. What I do first of all I have the wheel going very slowly, and I slap it more or less on center, like so, because that creates much less work to do, much less muscle to do when I'm actually centering. You might have some WD-40 on that pedal. Pedal's a little bit stiff. So you can see that very quickly I've got the clay on centre with only one relatively small pulling up. It's not a lot of up and down and up and down and up and downs with this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a cylinder form, and then I'm going to belly it out, because that's equivalent to just stretching clay if you were making a hand-built piece. So I'll just do this quickly. And I'll just check the thickness of that. I don't have a needle here, so I can just use the knife because I'll compress it, recompress it. That's about 8 millimeters depth at the moment, which is a little bit more, slightly more than I want. I just want it to be a little bit less than that. And then I'll be pulling up a cylinder. Keeping the top well in, because that helps you keep the cylinder under control. And even if you're making round pots, it's really important that you get even thickness height, or relatively even thickness height, right from the beginning. And then what we do is we thin out the top and the bottom if we're making a round bellied pot, because the middle has to stretch more. Each time I bring it up, I keep the top in, because that helps keep the thing under control. And also pulling up, I go right in underneath with my finger there. I'm quite a slow thrower. Other people throw very, very fast, but I was trained in a school on a kick wheel, and interestingly enough, if you were trained in Sydney, that was very, very common in the days when I was trained. If you were trained in Melbourne, you were trained on electric wheels, and it was a very continental European rather than a Leach Hamada tradition of pottery making. So you can often tell where a person trained, a person of my age, where they trained, by looking at how fast they have the wheel going. If this was a cooking demonstration, I would switch to a finished pot now, but this is not a cooking demonstration, this is clay, and it demands a bit of time and attention. Okay, so we're a little bit thicker here because that's where I'm going to be bellying it out. I've left a reasonable amount of clay on this third because I'm going to be bellying this out wide and I don't want it to collapse. So that'll be a support curve which I will cut off before I take the pot off the wheel. Flexible rib, throwing out onto the rib, not just pressing the rib in. And you actually take clay off because you don't want to have super soft clay on the surface like a slurry, because I'm going to be putting an underglaze stain directly onto the wet clay. And if the clay is too wet, the underglaze stain will go on very thin. So I want to get all the throwing lines and all the slurry off the surface. Okay, so this is just a commercial black underglaze. I'm going to put it on, laying it on the surface, not scrubbing. This is actually better done with a more mop type brush, but this is just the one I have to hand at the moment. And I would certainly use one of these for spreading it out after. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to stretch the clay. I'm going to apply to the surface a deflocculant, a commercial deflocculant, Dispex. And a deflocculant is usually used in clay slips, casting slips, and also in the making of terra sigillatas. And it's Dispex, which I'm actually using, is a commercial mix of deflocculants. And what that does, it will affect the clay, and it will, what we call, set up the clay surface. What can sometimes be a problem if you're using underglazes is if you put on the underglaze too thickly, and it's conceivable that I might have put it on too thickly here, then it's liable to be a barrier to the sodium silicate or the Dispex, the deflocculant, acting on the clay. And so we will test it. You know, the worst thing is that it doesn't happen. What I'm going to do is, normally you would do this part and then you leave it sitting for a little while, but because we're doing a direct demonstration, I'm actually going to use a heat gun just to slightly stiffen it up before we put the sodium silicate on the surface. I'm not making the surface stiff so much as I'm making it drier, so that when I put the sodium silicate on, it doesn't lift off all of the underglaze. So this is a heat gun. You can also use a hairdryer. I actually prefer to use a hairdryer these days because I'm trying not to actually make the surface dry and stiff, so I don't want the additional heat that you get from a heat gun. What I want is warm air being blown. what I want to do is I want to get rid of the shine, the wet shine that is on the underglaze. So I don't want it to be dry, but I want it to be not shiny and wet, because then when I put the sodium silicate on, it will lift off the underglaze. Okay, so that should be enough. There we go. And we will put on the sodium silicate. The Dispex, this is brand name Dispex. Darvan is another brand name for a deflocculant. This is a new container because my previous container had dried out. The deflocculant will dry out over time, even if it's in a sealed container. You can reconstitute it with boiling water, but there's not time to do that this morning, and I needed to buy some anyway. So I'm laying this on. I'm not scrubbing the surface, I'm laying it on. If you find that a whole lot of the black is coming off, see how that's relatively little black coming off? If you find a lot of black is coming off, the surface is too wet. It should brush pretty smoothly and evenly all the way down. Just a note that when you've used deflocculant on a clay, it should not be used for anything other than making slips, because the deflocculant will make the clay very, very difficult to handle. It will tend to make it go into a slip rather than a plastic clay, and that's not desirable. Okay, now what we do is, I'm hoping that that will transfer through the underglaze, and so I will just check first of all to see up here whether it's doing that which I want to. And what I'm looking for is cracks appearing. They're starting to just here, but it's still too wet. So we would leave this to just stiffen up a little bit to let the sodium silicate migrate through to act on the clay itself. I think also warming it will probably help it, so I might use the heat gun, but I'll just do that and then I'll come back and you'll see that it is once again not as shiny wet, just like when we put the underglaze on. We're not hardening the surface, what we're doing is drying it. Let it sit for a while so that the Dispex, the deflocculant, is actually working through to the clay. What happens is that a lot of the underglazes have gums and things in them to make them more brushable, and that acts as a kind of a barrier to the migration of the water. And so what we're doing here is we're stretching the clay from the inside. I will also show afterwards just a little demonstration of how this can be very effective with hand building, with making slabs. What will happen here is that any marks that you've made on this will show up as deeper cracks, So what you can do is you can use a, textured comb or a rib that's got a couple of notches cut in it, and you can use it to make wavy lines, and it will show those wavy lines up more. This has got slightly dominant horizontal lines, probably because there was a little bit of slurry left in throwing lines. It was probably just a little bit, wetter in the points between the throwing lines when I was scraping the surface, when I was trying to scrape all the slurry off. So I'm just throwing with one hand there, and I'm slowly stretching out the surface. You can also do things like, make it a not spherical form. And see how that gets darker in that crease there, and that can be quite effective in terms of, of defining form. I'm using a rib now because using my fingers puts pressure on a very small area. We want to make sure we don't have a collapse here because we've got this going in quite a way. And what we can do with that, we can, if we want to, accentuate that with I'm just using my fingernail, but it would probably be more effective with a knife or a sgraffito tool. Like so. And then this can get folded over to make a fat rim. Yeah, so you've got a nice fat rim, and then you can come back and you can put solid underglaze colour on that rim there to make it, to complete that kind of shadowing effect, so it's the colour talking about the form. There we go. And last, I push this bottom part out because you don't want it to be having a big overhang when you're doing the, the fine stretching work. So I'm stretching that out now to make it a more rounded form. So you can, you could do some lugs if you wanted to. You could do a lid on these. But what I'll do is I'll just trim off that excess clay. Remember how I left that thicker at the base because I wanted the support. So now I'm cutting off that excess clay. We can still come back and trim it. So we can do trimming or turning on it, but with this, it's not really necessary. I don't think there's anything to be gained in this because it's not a functional item that's going to have a, it's going to be washed or whatever. So, it doesn't want to have a fully turned foot in it. What we want to do is just have it finish. So we'll do solid colour down there again, so it ties in the top and the bottom, so the colour is denser when it's a smaller circumference and it is cracking open when it's stretched. You can also do things like you can come in and you can stretch like this. And see how it cracks a bit more when you stretch a bit more, and so it can give you a shell-like quality that breaks away a little bit from the, the spherical. Was lucky. Okay, so you can work with that all over. Okay, so that's basically a decoration that's complete in itself, but it's surface and it's part of what you do right at the beginning. Even if you're making a pot that's going to be ultimately underglazed or slipped, terra sigillata, underglazed tissue transfer decals, all of that, you have to map it out much more than you do with this kind of technique where it's essentially part of the act of throwing. What I'm doing, I just got a bit of the white clay, I brushed some of the underglaze on it, brushed a little bit of the deflocculant on it, and it was sitting there while I was doing those other demonstrations. And now what I'm doing is stretching it, which is basically what we did with the other on the wheel. And you can see where the sodium silicate has pooled, you're getting much deeper cracks, and see how this is very, very fine cracks here. And stretching it, you can actually get a lot of movement in the cracking. And then that becomes quite a nice slab to work to make, pots or whatever, or plates or fins. I can never stop myself stretching. I want to go to the point where it breaks. Whoops, that was it. Because I like that broken edge as well. I like this edge, which is contained. And you can go back and you can clean that and make it a contained frame. But I like the fact that this suggests it goes beyond, and it talks about the action of making it. Okay, so I'm just doing a plain version of what I did last time, which is working with texture on the clay before you actually finish throwing the piece. It's different to the kind of stamping or texture that you put in after you throw a piece, because that's fairly covered, online and everywhere else. And so what we're going to do with this is we're going to put some pattern in the surface, and I'll go slowly. There we go. And then what we'll be doing is we'll be stretching that just like we did before. Oh, we're putting sodium silicate on it when we Dispex. And this one won't have the underglaze on it, so hopefully it should work more immediately. I'm just laying it on the surface. I'm not scrubbing the surface because I don't want to flatten all of that texture or pattern. But you could also just texture this. You could do just straight lines with a much deeper rib around it. And then hopefully this will work a little bit quicker. Always put tops back on jars because you don't think that you'll knock them and spill them, but you always do if you haven't done that. Okay, we'll just see whether it's working yet. Not quite yet. So we just let it sit for a while and work its way into the clay. I might help that along just a little bit with the heat gun. Which more warms it up so that it's more fluid than it's drying it. I want it to be working with the clay surface. That's still a bit shiny, but I'm hoping that that might be enough. We're working here mid-winter in Canberra, and so despite the fact it's a sunny day, things are not necessarily as dry. Oops, that can happen when you've got a sticky inside. The rib actually sticks. It's one of the reasons I tend to use my hand initially rather than a rib. This is not, oh it is, it's cracking on the thin bits. So it's migrated into the texture, and you can see if you did a very deep texture with, you know, basically ribs, that they would all be cracking with this stretching out. The clay is pretty soft, as you can see. It's kind of draping over my fingers, and it's pretty soft and it's split there, but we're not going to worry about that too much at the moment. We'll continue beyond that. And see how you're starting to get a very eroded sort of texture in that. We've got a couple of holes there, and that would be because probably the sodium silicate, the deflocculant, Dispex, pooled in those sections. So we'll just see how far we can take this without the whole thing collapsing. The whole thing might collapse, and you know, there are worse things in the world than a pot collapsing. It, in fact, in some respects, when I look at this now, the cracks on the decoration, the texture, and the breaking open parts actually make it look like it's really weathered and old. And so, you might want to make archaeological artifacts, and this might be a way to do it. I'm now working in between those sections and pushing out a little bit more. So I'm working with what was, not an ideal example of what I was seeking to show. It's not all regular and it's not all smooth, but it definitely has possibilities in a kind of a sculptural sense. I think that, that very eroded sort of surface there, it speaks of age. Whoops, there we go. So, what do we do with a collapse? What we do is we collapse it more. Maybe we fold all of that in, like so. And that starts to have possibilities. It's now continuing to go. But you can see how you could use that, and you could take sections of this and use them, as slabs to assemble something else, stiffen them up and leave them to create another piece that's made out of slabs. And then this piece could be missing its top half. There we go. That's quite nice the way that rolls over. So we'll do that a little bit more. Yeah, so surface, as I say, surface is not superficial. It's something that you do an action on the surface of the clay, and you can end up making something that you never expected you would do in the end. This is not what I had planned to do, but that's okay, because this is a real life studio demonstration, and this is exactly the kind of thing that I do that develops new ideas. There, and smoothed it out. Okay, so that's, and what we would do is I would trim that underneath just the same as I did before and lift it off, and I wouldn't do much else to it. You may find that you wanted to talk a little bit about the pot that it used to be, and so you might give it a little lug or a handle on one side. So that talks a little bit about the pot it used to be, but it's lost the matching lug on this side. And what we want to do in the end is we want to tell stories.